All right, 402. That's what I was waiting for. Hello, and welcome to NEWIE's latest virtual Ask Me Anything session. My name is Deanna Sassarosi. I am the NEWIE co-chair of the Rising Professionals group. I am truly honored to be moderating today's Ask Me Anything conversation with a panel of speakers from Out in Energy, a national community for openly lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex professionals working across the energy and climate field. Today's Ask Me Anything is just one in a series of conversations that NEWIE is hosting with a number of incredible leaders in the energy and environmental fields. So the NEWIE board actually launched this AMA series at the onset of the pandemic as a way to provide our members and community with a way to connect with leading women in energy environment, as well as give you direct access and an opportunity to ask them questions about their careers, their area of expertise in the industry, and more. You can ask them anything. It's been a big success, and we're continuing the event even as we return to in-person meetings. Before we get started, I want to make a few announcements and start by thanking the sponsor of today's event, First Light Power. On behalf of everyone at NEWIE, I want to extend a huge thank you to our annual event sponsors, Concentric, Eversource, First Light, Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and Robinson & Cole, who not only make our in-person events possible, but support continued NEWIE programming in this virtual space. We have several upcoming events, including our annual organizational roundtable. This event is for organizational level members to talk with our board and help set strategic direction for the organization. All the fun is going down on June 22nd via Zoom. If you are an organizational member, your primary contact person should have received an invitation and can get you some more information. Coming up soon, the week of June 27th is Chapter Week, and we have opportunities for you to network with other women in the energy and environmental fields happening throughout New England. So check our website for more information on that or our recent newsletter. In August, we're planning our annual Women Shaping the Agenda, a signature event where we hear from a panel of leaders on an issue of current interest in the energy and environmental fields. So be on the lookout for more information about the topic, the speaker, and the specific date. Right now we're targeting the first week of August. So more information will be coming soon on that. Make sure you are subscribed to our newsletter and keep an eye on our calendar and social channels for the future, for these events and future events. All right, now on to today's event. We have a great panel here for you all today. We hope that today's event will be interactive and conversational. Please submit your questions for our panelists using the Q&A function in Zoom. So not the chat function, the Q&A function. We've got a couple folks working behind the scenes, so if you accidentally submit to the chat, they should be able to get it in front of us, so we'll see it. I'll read them aloud after a short introduction and some preliminary prepared questions. You do have the ability to ask questions anonymously, so please make sure to do that if you don't want your name read out loud. So please start thinking of your questions and sending them our way. So we will start off with some introductions. Here with me today, I have Zachary Strauss. He is a policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy, as well as the founder of Out in Energy. We have Gia Clark. She is a senior director at Level 10 Energy. We have Edon Hopner, second secretary, trade and economic at the New England Embassy in Washington, D.C., as well as Nicole Lepre, policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy. So we're going to jump right in. My first question for you all. Can you tell us a little bit about your professional career path, how you got to the position that you are in today? So whichever one of you wants to jump in first.
I'm happy to jump right in. Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Strauss. So great to be here. As Deanna mentioned, I am the founder and president of Out in Energy, as well as a policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy. My journey really began in Houston, where I'm from. Houston is the energy capital of the world. My father had worked in oil and gas for 35 years, but Houston's also not just the energy capital of the world, it's also the epicenter of climate change. So I saw lots of hurricanes, lots of flooding, directly impacted my life very personally. Went to school for foreign policy, but also ecological science, ended up living in earthquake and nuclear countries like Japan, as well as in France, which is the most dominant nuclear country in the world. And sort of taking all of that in, and having lived abroad in different places, came back to the US to work on climate action, as well as domestic resilience and distributed energy, focusing a lot on geothermal energy, but having taken a lot of different career paths, working at the OECD, working at the Chilean embassy, working for the Japanese government. So taking a lot of different routes, but always focusing on how do we make our communities more resilient, and how do we increase the share of renewables in our grid so that people like my family in Houston can have a home in a place that's safe.
Cool.
I'm happy to go. I'm Nicole Lepre. I'm also a policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy with Zach. I started out my career working in solar and wind energy development. I did that for about 5 years. That was kind of more the business side of things, and I wanted to get into policy. So I went to grad school for a year to study energy policy and regulation, got really into the transportation space and electric vehicles. And that's how I found myself at Atlas. So I'm here now, and I work almost entirely in electric vehicle policy research.
Very cool. Gia, how about yourself?
Yeah, I passed through, my undergraduate work was actually in public health, and then I moved into landscape architecture, which I learned, right, sort of thinking about public health and health impacts related to climate change, and then went into landscape architecture, looking at essentially land use and how those things combined together, how we, what we choose to do with our land, and sort of the communities that land use choices impact for the neighboring communities. And then ended up, sort of by luck, which we can talk about later, working for a renewable energy developer, sort of bringing those sort of perspectives together for GIS scouting, land use, permanent environmental impact work to get renewable energy projects built. And then moved, I was there doing development for about a decade, and then moved to level 10 just this past September, essentially sort of staying in the renewable energy space, but from a sort of software implementation side as opposed to direct development.
Very cool. Edon, how about yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnei te mihi kia koutou. Ko Edon Hopana, aho. Good afternoon, everyone. What I've just spoken is a few words in Te Reo Māori, which is the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand. As Deanna mentioned, I'm the Second Secretary Trade and Economic at the New Zealand Embassy in DC, not New England, although I love New England. Yeah, where I cover climate and energy issues. My career path is, I think, pretty straightforward. I studied law and history at university in New Zealand. I applied for the Foreign Service, and that was in 2014, so I've been there for 8 years now. And I very intentionally tried to get a very broad range of experiences. So I've been in our North Asia division covering our relationships with Japan and China, our economic division covering trade, investment, and taxation issues. Before being posted to DC, I covered Pacific regional issues, where I had the privilege to work in very small Pacific Island countries like Tuvalu and Nauru. And it was there that I really experienced firsthand, the importance of climate change and rising sea levels and the environmental impacts that climate change has. So it was a real privilege and something that I'm very passionate to work on in our embassy in DC.
Awesome. So as you can see, we've got a wide variety of backgrounds all over the world, and people who have been touched personally by climate change and are working to fight it. So very cool. Next question for you all. And so for those of you listening, feel free to send your questions via the Q&A feature of the chat at any time. I've got it open so I can ask those questions to our panelists. But until then, I'll just keep going with our discussion. What were the highs and lows of your career so far? What stands out?
I'm happy to kick that one off
Please do.
If that's okay. Yeah, I think one of the things I really love the opportunity to talk about is my career path, because it wasn't clear to me what I was going to be doing with my life. And so I think it's really interesting to think about those highs and lows. And in particular, after graduating with my master's degree in landscape architecture, really interested in doing these sort of large land use planning sort of actions. It was in the middle of the economic recession in 2009. And so there were essentially no jobs for that kind of work. And that was a really, really quite a severe low point for me, right? I had sort of moved my way from East Coast to West Coast, and ended up after grad school working in a cupcake shop, which was not what I thought I'd be doing with all the debt that I had acquired. And so that was a real low point for me. And I think it's important to sort of highlight, right, and sort of share that, like, I was 30, right? It was not my plan. I was supposed to be making more money than that at 30, and was working in a cupcake shop, but I did do a lot of networking during that window of time. I made a very extensive Excel spreadsheet and figured out who to get informational interviews with, and just kind of spent a lot of time doing that in between frosting cupcakes. And then that was a low. And then I think the high really is having joined Level 10 and being able to sort of take all of the time that I worked in the development side of it and sort of still continue to transition and grow and sort of take that knowledge and expand it into sort of new areas. And I feel like, right, just kind of continuing to push myself into these different arenas and challenge myself of, okay, what's next? What's the broadest reach that I can do? What are the impacts that I can make? So that's a sort of less specific high, but the low feels very crystal clear. So I think I just wanted to share that very real personal experience to anyone on the call today. And then, yeah, happy to pass it back. But I was thinking I wanted to kind of, be pretty honest about the fact that we have these visions of folks like myself and others on the video that maybe seem, we're just people too. And I think it's really important to sort of call out those sort of real moments in our time and our challenges. So that's
thank you.
More in my low than my high. But yeah,
I think that like with social media, we all get caught up in seeing everyone's highlight reel. So I think it's really important to share that we do experience lows, and we can still find success. Maybe not even despite, but maybe because of those lows. Anyone else from the panel? Would you like to tell us about some highs and lows that stick out for you?
I'm happy to go next. So I'll start with a few highs. So it is genuinely really incredible to represent your country kind of in a foreign service context, sitting at the UN with the kind of New Zealand flag in front of you, and there's also the travel involved. So I've been able to go to some pretty exotic out there places. But then I guess the most impactful for me has just been the ability to craft and provide advice to essentially my elected representatives that they then use in their exchanges with other kind of foreign leaders or in speeches. And it's quite cool to sort of see your influence very directly being utilized, and kind of your work being used in that way. I guess a low for me is experiencing kind of racism and the double whammy of being both gay and Indigenous in a professional context. I think for those of us who inhabit multiple, for lack of a better term, minority experiences, it can be a real force multiplier in not being able to be effective at your job. And I think in a New Zealand context, but just all over, there are times where it's been easier to lean on my queer identity rather than my Indigenous identity, where, in some cases you're expected to kind of be the cultural handbook or the translator, but then that experience is kind of ridiculed or not appreciated, or just like the outright racism. And sometimes from people who in the queer space are sometimes allies. So, you kind of have to walk this tightrope at times. But yeah, that's probably a real low point for me.
Wow, such a thoughtful response. Thank you. I can definitely relate. There's so many aspects of our identities that we kind of play into or play out of and cover up or express in the workplace. And sometimes it's difficult to be your true self. So Zach, Nicole, we've got some more questions coming in the chat, but if you want to speak to the previous one, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I could.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Sure. I'll touch on a real quick. A high point for me, I think, was maybe about halfway through my year in grad school, and things really kind of just clicked for me, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and that was electric vehicles. And before that, I knew I wanted to do clean energy. I'd been doing clean energy, but it was that point where I first was really excited about a certain topic. I felt like I knew a lot about it. And that just felt really good. It actually made the job search pretty fun. Like the interviews were fun because I was excited about what I wanted to do. So that was a high for me. No notable lows really, maybe just the counter of that, like not really knowing exactly what I want to do, not feeling super good at things early on.
Yeah, it's always a challenge to early on in your career to figure out what you want to do, but once you do, it's like I beat life. I know what I'm meant to do. Zach, how about yourself? I think you're going to say something.
Sure. Yeah, I've had a few highs, one of which is that my jobs have taken me to all parts of the world, and I've had the opportunity to teach in schools in Japan and work with Chilean ambassadors in France, and assist victims of crime in Spain. So I've been able to do a host of things that have really enriched my life. At my last job, I had the privilege of working with a lot of veterans. I used to help manage program for veterans in clean energy, and I helped to run a fellowship program as well as a summit every year for transitioning service members who were looking for purpose and jobs in the civilian workforce, who really didn't know what to do, and we're really helping them find jobs and network and grow their career opportunities in clean energy. That was one of the best things I got to do. I also had the joy of creating Outer Energy and connecting the queer community. There was a gap and there was a void in that space. That organization hadn't really been created on a national level. So I decided to take the plunge and try it myself. And it seems like I've done an okay job so far. So that has been a really big high for me. Some lows might be probably working through imposter syndrome. I think a lot of queer people and other minorities struggle with not knowing if they're good enough, not knowing if they're smart enough to be in the room, knowing if they should contribute or if their contribution is valuable. So I've struggled with that for sure, as both a queer person and as a shorter man in a room of taller straight people. I've never really felt like my contribution has mattered as much as, and I think I'm working through that. But I lived through an earthquake while working in Japan, and I was a displaced person for quite a while. And I used to teach lessons outdoors or in makeshift classrooms where children had opportunities to learn, despite the fact that some of their houses had been destroyed. That was probably the low in my career, but excited to hear more from the audience and from you, Dina.
All right, first question from our audience. How can people be better allies for the LGBT community in the workplace?
I'm happy to go first if everyone is pondering. I've been asked this question a number of times, and I think I've landed on a few things. One is listening. Just listen to what we have to say. I think the experience of a queer person is distinct from that of a heterosexual person, just because we live through a lot of shame and rejection of ourselves and internalized self-hatred and homophobia. And those things permeate into our workplace and into our professional lives, and that can impact the way we do stuff. So just listening to our history. We don't learn about LGBTQ history, learn about that, because that has a lot of impact on what the reality is. Why are there not that many queer people in the room? Maybe it's because we weren't allowed to be in the room. Maybe we weren't even provided the opportunities to have security clearances to be in that room until the 21st century. So learning our history is one, listening to us when we express certain things about our experiences. Using pronouns, like just those simple things like adding your pronouns to your email signature can be really simple. And advocating on behalf of queer people when we're not in the room. So even when we're not here, not to virtual signal, but because you think it's the right thing to do, advocate on behalf of inclusive language or on behalf of, inclusive work policies, whether that's for spouses or that's for gender neutral bathrooms or whatever it might be. Advocacy should go beyond virtual signaling. So even when we're not in the room, it should be something that allies engage with.
Yes, you just gave me a light bulb moment, Zach, on the last two things you said, because I feel like I struggle with imposter syndrome a lot, like more than the average person. Like every day I feel a weight of like, I hope I don't say something stupid and ruin my career. And I it's difficult for me to think like where that came from. But after what you just said, I'm like, oh, maybe it came from the month of like hating who I was because I knew I was gay and was terrified to tell anyone. So thank you for that moment. Anyone else on the panel? What do you all think? How can people be better allies at work?
I can contribute something there. I feel like one of the things that's interesting about sort of the way that I physically show up into a space is that I can, I pass as a white lady, and I can move pretty seamlessly through a lot of social situations, and a lot of assumptions are made about me as such. And so I think one of the things that's constantly important to keep in mind as an ally is that you don't know the history of the person that you're speaking with, and so to try and capture those assumptions, and to make open-ended questions as opposed to statements, and or to Zach's point about pronoun use, and or assumptions about the people that we're with intimately in our lives, and the way that we've structured our families. So yeah, I think that's one of those ones that I think I sort of have a particular role in the queer community as someone that can kind of choose when and where to out myself. And that's not the case for most of the people that I, certainly my partner and the community that I live in. So I do feel like it's a little bit like a spy sometimes, right? Like, and sort of my job is to sort of figure out when and where to sort of make comments. But I think it's important for our allies to also play that role and to be really mindful.
Absolutely, love it. Nicole, you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out exactly how to phrase this to not give any like bad advice, because some people are more private than others, but like for me, I've been in situations, whether it's work or even just other types of like organizations, sports, whatever, and I'll talk about my girlfriend, I'll tell people about her, talk about like my life, like gay parts of my life, and nobody will ever talk about it back to me or ask me about it. Like they seem a little worried about it. So I guess just like don't necessarily have to be that worried about it. If someone is talking about their partner, you could probably be like, hey, how was your weekend? Did you and your partner do anything? If you're asking, other straight people that, like, you could probably talk about it.
Yeah,
with
that's
caution, I guess. If someone isn't talking about their queer partner, then be careful, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nicole. I think some people are often hesitant to, maybe because they're not used to talking about people in same-sex relationships. They're not used to asking, what did you and your girlfriend do this weekend? But it's like a totally normal like aspect of conversation for heterosexual couples. So yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Edon, would you like to add anything here, or shall we move on?
Yeah, I think everyone has basically said what I was going to say, but I just think that that normalizing kind of rainbow life and not making assumptions is a really, really good point. It's like a very strange thing to have to correct superiors when they ask you how your girlfriend is, because then you have to go through this process of, how do I, do I like correct them? Then are they going to feel a bit guilty? And then do I have to like stroke their ego? And so you have to kind of make all these decisions. I guess the other thing is just echoing Zach's point about listening and supporting any initiative that a rainbow person suggests. If you are in a position of discretionary power, just basically always choose to support what those who have experienced that kind of discrimination suggest is a pretty sounds simple, but is a very, I think, good approach.
Absolutely. All right, our next question, we've got a lot from the audience. What can organizations like NEWIEE do more of and or do better to help with those challenges and build an inclusive and supportive space? You guys, a couple moments to ponder.
I would jump quickly to say mentorship is really crucial. So if there are queer people who are in your organization, if there's a mentorship program for them, maybe pair them with someone who might have that same shared experience. Yeah, and obviously there's Pride Month. There's also LGBTQ History Month that could be recognized. Yeah, gender affirmations, things like that are pretty good. But I think the mentorship piece and also maybe appointing people or giving people opportunities from minority communities to serve in leadership roles, to give them agency and to make sure that their voices are heard and that they're incorporated.
Great. Any comment from others? All right, we'll go ahead and move on. Any recommended resources for companies to start, grow, and enhance ally support at their business? You got something, Zach, I know it.
I'm happy to jump in. I have lots of thoughts. So there's a group called the Rainbow Chamber of Commerce, which does work that is specifically tailored towards engaging with queer-owned businesses. And there's a certification that companies can even qualify for, that is sort of a supplier diversity certification that says you are a rainbow business or you're a rainbow engagement business, that you actively engage with an LGBTQ owned business. In California, I know that's certainly a thing. They have their own Rainbow Chamber of Commerce, but I'm sure New England might have one as well. So Human Rights Campaign also has lots of resources out there on their website that directly relate to engagement on the corporate level, as well as I would also just say, like, peruse what's happening amongst our youth. So the Trevor Project, which works directly with LGBTQ youth, they put out a survey every year that displays essentially the state of play for what is happening amongst our queer youth, which are going to be your future employees. A lot of this goes up until 24 years old. So just surveying, like, what is happening to our young people and how do we grow a pipeline that supports these young people, because they're dealing with higher levels of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, distraction, like disbursement from their homes, homelessness, right? So there are lots of things that queer youth and queer young people are dealing with that other straight people are not having to do it, and they're taking that with them again into their professional lives. So how do you accommodate that? How do you recognize it for what it is? And how do you affirm that and tell people that they're equal, they're dignified, they're valuable? So there's all these sorts of things that we should think about. But there are lots of resources out there, again, from Trevor Project, Human Rights Campaign, and the Rainbow Chamber of Commerce.
That's a great point about the pipeline that I hadn't considered. The challenges of LGBT youth are the challenges of future LGBT professionals. So supporting them is a huge aspect of it. Any comment from others?
Yeah, I think those are great comments, Zach. I always really appreciate you're sort of very well articulated and sort of macro view on things. I think it's a really valuable perspective. And I think thinking about, as individuals participating on this webinar or within your various organizations also coming at it, by just volunteering in your local communities right now, so like you don't have to start necessarily with your company, right? You can also just start as a person. And just starting there, I think committing personally to that will help you gather that sort of understanding on a really foundational level to then figure out how to incorporate it into your work world. I think sometimes it can feel so big when approaching it from a company perspective, but really sort of starting to commit personally with your free time in those organizations, so that you get to know folks, and then that will help inform how you can explain it and sort of work through it in your kind of corporate or office life.
Yeah, so kind of like educating yourself first, so you're prepared to have these discussions. Great. Go ahead, Edon.
Yeah, thanks. So like in New Zealand, there's a saying which in Māori is like, he hata me nui o te ao, which is translates basically as to what is the most important thing in the world. And then the response is he tangata, which is the people. And I think a really important resource that, that we often or sometimes overlook is just our own personal experiences and the way that those can inform advice to other rainbow professionals and colleagues and people in this space. So like one thing that companies can do, I think, is create safe spaces where rainbow staff can get together and organize and speak and network. So supporting rainbow organizations internally, externally, that kind of collective group response to these kinds of situations, I found really, really helpful both in a diplomatic career perspective, because there are just issues that gay diplomats face that you would have like no idea about unless you spoke to kind of people who've gone through this already. And then kind of empowering those conversations. So it kind of points to that mentorship point that Zach raised. But yeah, I think there's just like a real kind of force multiplier in having safe spaces and supporting rainbow organizations inside your network.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the idea of employee resource groups or ERGs, a lot of bigger companies have them, but even in our small company Atlas, we do have a little, queer resource group, so to speak, that supports one another, and it's empowered by our director and our staff. And we actually have at our office internal conversations around affinity months, whether that's Black History Month, Women's History Month, Pride Month, where we actually discuss resources and we engage on these topics and how it impacts society, but also our work. So discrimination actually hinders work productivity, affirmation increases that, and it makes people more excited to come to work and makes them better at their jobs. So the more you affirm those people at your work and engage cisgender heteronormative people in that too, they learn, and it creates a connection between your queer staff and your non-queer staff. So there's a level of camaraderie that's created there. So when people are able to share their experiences with their staff, it makes them feel more comfortable to be who they are around them. So when they're able to share their past and their feelings, I guess, their thoughts, it helps them grow as a professional.
Absolutely. I think that type of community and support is so crucial. I mean, as human beings, we need connection, we need community. And like you said, if we have that at work, we're happier, we're more likely to stay, we're more productive, we're better at our jobs. So it just makes sense. All right, bunch of questions coming in. Next one. What do you do as self-care? What do you do for self-care after the shock, pain, and exhaustion after facing microaggressions? Anyone got some good strategies, tips, how to deal with these things, these challenges we face?
I'm happy to go.
Go for it.
Oh, sorry, Zach, you go.
Go ahead.
All you eat on.
Yeah, so I connect with friends and kind of trusted contacts. Sometimes, things can seem really terrible, and then when you talk it out with, say, people who you trust, trusted colleagues, that can kind of change your perspective. Or other times, it can genuinely be quite bad, and then they kind of provide that support needed to kind of get you through a bad time. Yeah, which again, I think just points to the importance of having and supporting kind of strong networks and connections within the rainbow community.
Absolutely.
I did a few things. Well, there was a moment in my life where someone in my own community I'm bisexual or queer, and someone was like, oh, bisexuality doesn't exist. And I was what they call bi erased. And essentially it's more like standing your ground, and you sort of rebuff that aggression, and you don't allow it to, if you allow it to pass over you, it normalizes the statement. So it's essentially knowing your history, knowing who you are, and rebuffing the statement and asserting yourself. That's not always easy, but essentially, standing your own. I also watch a lot of affirming media. There isn't a lot of it, or there hasn't been as much of it in the past, but it's really proliferating in recent years. So it's, whether that's books or film or TV or anything that really makes you feel like you belong, helps to sort of normally ground you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, anytime my wife and I are watching a show and there's a queer couple, or specifically a lesbian couple, we're like, look, lesbians, people like us. So that definitely helps, seeing people like you. Nicole, Gia, any comment on that? Self-care things?
Nothing new. Agree with the others.
I guess one thing I did, I was doing a lot of permitting work in rural communities for several years, and having a really hard time with the politics in the summer of 2015. And as a result of, I was out at that time at my company and while supporting my company, but the work I was doing was in other communities, which were much more hostile. And so I was very closeted in those experiences. I had a beard name for my wife, like told people nothing about me when doing that portion of my work. And I definitely sort of went really far into sort of that summer for Pride. I went really big in costuming and makeup and did a pretty over the top series of days of like massive wigs and really just kind of doubling down then on my like, as much as I would have to repress it in this side, I sort of went way bigger in my queerness in those months. I mean, I tend to be fairly far over there anyway, but it was a really powerful and really satisfying way to kind of release some of that tension that I was experiencing in my work world.
I love that. Great story. Thank you for sharing. Our next question from the audience. Max writes, I've been interviewing at various companies and noticed that senior management is, oh, sorry, someone else put another one in. I lost it. I've been interviewing at various companies and noticed that senior management is overwhelmingly white, cis, and usually male, even at places where the junior cohort is quite diverse. Do you have any thoughts on how we can accelerate diversity at the upper levels, or will this just take time?
I think about this all the time. As somebody who is trying to create a community of queer people and energy for the purpose of developing more, higher level professionals in this space, it has to be really intentional. I have been, interviewing and hiring people for a while, and you have to seek out people. Well, the thing is now that Out on Energy exists, there are these nodes, right? There's Asians in Energy, Hispanics in Energy, Association for Blacks in Energy, Women in Energy Network. There are all these organizations that exist for this exact purpose, to connect you with the pipeline professionals of tomorrow in these communities that have historically been underrepresented. And the people in those communities that put in the work to create that community for you. All you have to do is reach out to them and have them circulate that opportunity, have you engage with their members, see if there are people interested. And that's sort of the goal, is to connect that pipeline to the professional opportunities, but it requires a lot of intentionality. You have to build in more time on the front end when you have to recruit. So recruitment takes longer, right? You have to think about, it's a lot easier if you just take the top crop from, the LinkedIn that you send out, but it's because we're underrepresented, there are fewer of us who are out there, right? So it's a matter of reaching out to those people, growing those relationships with those organizations so that you can grow that representation.
I love that. So really being intentional as we develop, the next generation of pipelines for leadership. Any other comments? How we can accelerate diversity at the upper levels? All right, we will move on. We've got this question's pretty long. Echoing a lot of what's been said, as a queer person of color and neurodivergent engineer, it feels like a lot of pressure to both call out injustices while being in a precarious position as a student intern trying to get a full-time job. Every day I'm scared that I'm not passing as normal enough to be allowed to speak to stakeholders, or they don't take me seriously. My workplace is well-meaning, but there's also small things, like my office only has gendered bathrooms, and on my first day, my manager assumed which one I'd use, and honestly, I wasn't sure which one I wanted to. It's frustrating to go through interview and job search rounds at what seems like a good workplace, only to find out they're super queer-phobic or just don't have the right accommodations. I feel this pressure that I don't want to screw up early in my career. Any tips there?
I think I don't know if I have any tips, but I want to thank you for that question, right? Like I feel like that is I personally don't have those same challenges, but certainly many of my close friends and my partner have experienced that, and it is incredibly difficult, right? That bathrooms are one of the many things that you listed there, but is a particularly you know, I think obvious one that we can work on. And I don't know if I have any tips. I think we could kind of talk through it and see what comes up in this conversation, but I think it's important that you took the time to write that question. And I think I really just want to thank you for doing that, because I think that's exactly what we want to be talking about. It's like, okay, let's think through that. What do we need to do? And I'm thinking about, right, what is my company doing in those particular situations right now? And again, that's a sort of non-answer, but more of an appreciation for that statement, because I think it's incredibly challenging and absolutely relevant.
Yeah, this person sounds like they're just carrying so much stress and is very frustrated going through, you know, interviews that they think are going in the right direction, only to find out like they're not going to be accepted there, and they're not going to have the accommodations they need. Any thoughts from the other panelists? How to navigate this person's situation?
I do have one thought. You mentioned all of these things that make you different and how you're afraid that those things will make you not seem normal to your colleagues or stakeholders. But I'd flip it on its head and I'd say, look at all those things that make you different. Those are your assets. Those are things that make you a better candidate, things that make you a stronger applicant, because you do have different perspectives. You don't have one lived experience. You have many lived experiences of many different people that you can add value to your workplace, because you know more about the world perhaps than the people on your team. You have more to give, you have more to contribute. So I wouldn't look at those things as things that make you different or negative things. I look at those things that make you a stronger applicant, a better professional, and someone that has a lot more value to add.
Very well said, Zach. I think one of the best things about being queer is that we get to rewrite the idea of what's normal. So this person is totally normal because they're human, and we're all human, and that's normal. So your experience is totally valid. The person who asked this question. All right, go ahead.
Sorry, maybe I can just add one thing. Again, Zach, I just love the way you talk, and I really appreciate that. And I think that's one of the things that I personally struggle with, is like figuring out how to articulate. So it sounds like also like, I think we all can practice articulating those points of pushback, right? Like, so that there's like those moments where that comes up and it's like, okay, I've already practiced this. And yes, it's more work. We're used to having to do more work. But I think that's articulating it is something I always struggle with. And I think, you know, maybe finding ways to succinctly note, okay, I'm feeling, you know, tying together, I'm having this experience, and then tying it together with not a canned response, but essentially like, these are the reasons that to sort of quickly push back in those moments that is still can get some traction. I think that's, again, Zach, maybe you can just write us all some tips of how to articulate things. I just really love listening to you talk. But I think that's language is a really powerful tool in that way.
Beautiful. I love it. Next question. Have you found the energy space particularly difficult to succeed in as a queer person? And for Gia and Nicole as a woman/queer woman?
Nicole, I'm gonna have you go.
I guess I could say a little bit. I think there's a lot of spaces in this area where it's at least been challenging to be one of the only queer women in the space. I always find, you know, I think about these types of questions a lot. It's a little hard for me to answer because it's only been, this is the only experience I've had. I don't know what to compare it to, but it has definitely been, you know, strange, at least being like different, the only queer woman. And it's been really nice lately. Where I work now is 25% queer. And I don't know if I realized before how much of a difference that would make in just how I feel every day and how comfortable I feel. Work can be fun. So I answered like 5% of that question.
No, that was great. Thank you. Anyone
I
else?
don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think about that one. I definitely feel like it's tricky.
Mhm.
And I ask for more money all the time is one of my go-tos. Like, I'm not joking. I think it's really important to sort of recognize that and sort of bring that up.
That's a great point.
I'm a little bit more senior, right? I'm a little bit older. I have a little bit more leverage than folks might have at a more junior phase. But I do feel like that's something that I'm constantly bringing up to my managers in various places, is like, at every opportunity, I'm going to ask you more money because it is harder for me. And like, but not putting it quite, again, I need to get my language right. So I have to figure out who I'm talking to and sort of figure out the right sort of social way to broach that. But
Mhm.
I do work that into many conversations. And I don't feel like I'm a capitalist, but I feel like that's the world we live in. So I make sure to use those leverages where I have to.
So in the chat, emotional labor surcharge. Haven't heard that term. I like it. All right, next question. When you were early career professionals, how did you distinguish between being disrespected based on your marginalized identities versus simply being treated as inferior in the workplace hierarchy? Whew, that's a big one.
Can you repeat that?
When you were early career professionals, how did you distinguish between being disrespected based on your marginalized identities versus simply being treated as inferior in the workplace hierarchy?
Oh, I see.
First off, I feel like no one should be treated inferior.
I was gonna say,
Even if you're,
neither one's okay.
yeah, like even if you're an entry-level employee, you should still be treated with respect.
I have one anecdote I could share, perhaps. I worked at a large think tank in the past, and I was an entry-level worker, and I was also openly LGBTQ. Like from when like the first 2 months I was there, I was like emceeing a pride event. Essentially, I was just thrust into this position. But I had been tokenized by some of the senior level staff at that company, not in a negative way. It wasn't like nefarious, but it was very lonely onlying. It was almost like, I don't know how to talk to you about anything else. I don't know how to communicate this to you. I think a lot of the times senior management doesn't know how, they don't have the language. They don't know how to communicate. They don't never like spoken to another person about these topics before. And they don't, maybe they don't stumble, but they don't quite have it right yet. They don't have the smooth articulation of how to just talk to you like a regular person, because we are regular people. We just happen to love a different kind of person sometimes. So sometimes if it comes across as disrespectful, I often just chalk it up to like, maybe they're not used to this. Maybe they haven't been exposed to this. Maybe they don't have the right language yet. And it's not up to us to teach them, but it is sort of up to us to sort of maybe help them along in that regard.
I would, what that question makes me think of though is, I mean, it is for me, at least me, a pretty common experience all the time, not really at work, or like maybe at work, at a store, someone's rude to you, somewhere else, someone's rude to you. You never really do know, do you, if it's because you're gay or queer. So I mean, that is, I guess, something to keep in mind. Like, this is something that queer people have to deal with, like never really knowing if like someone was bad to you because you were queer, and then like maybe if it was because you're queer, they're like, it's not because you're queer, it's because you're a freshman or whatever, and it's just like another thing to worry about. So it kind of doesn't really matter whether it was because you're queer or not. Like, it's part of being queer that's an additional thing you have to deal with if someone's like shitty to you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to jump in if that's okay. Yeah, so straight off the bat, I think any kind of disrespect is bad. You should treat your junior employees with the same kind of respect that you treat your most senior employees. I think that kind of egalitarianism is good for a company or any kind of organization. In terms of the distinguishing between homophobia or any kind of discrimination and junior typeness, I mean, I've personally experienced both, and I think it's kind of. I mean, my sense is I mean, I feel like it comes down to tone and your relationship with that person and the kind of social context. But I think ultimately it's more about how you manage that and how like you respond to that. Like, do you respond to that in a way that kind of lets them kind of have power over you in a kind of social context, or do you brush it off, build that resiliency, reach out to your networks, and kind of move forward. I think there's also, a spectrum of bad behavior. There's kind of unconscious, not necessarily malicious discrimination, and then there really is the kind of the outright, bad stuff. And I think as a person of color in an American context, as a Māori Indigenous person in a New Zealand context, but also someone as gay, you're just going to get it. You're just going to get those comments, those little microaggressions, and you kind of have to build that thick skin. But yeah, learning to be resilient and learning to have strength and community, I think, is important.
Absolutely. I'm going to do one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask you guys our last question that we ask after every AMA. So last one from the audience here. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions within the hour. So last question from the audience here. My 14-year-old daughter is struggling with how she identifies, and her educational strength is math and science. As a 14-year-old, she naturally suffers from a bit of imposter syndrome. As representatives of both LGBTQ+ and employees in STEM roles, can you talk about how you navigated that as a teenager? So strong in math and science, teenager, LGBT, how should this person navigate that, this person's daughter?
I feel like this is easier said than done, but something I've noticed, because I've struggled with that a bit too. And for me, I've definitely been negatively impacted by not being worried to seem like I don't know what I'm doing. So I don't have in the past not asked a lot of questions. And then I started working, and I sort of noticed a lot of the guys I was working with were asking so many questions, almost an annoying amount of questions. Just it was the person who was giving them the work, it was that person's responsibility to make sure they knew all the things they needed to know to get this done. And I found that pretty inspirational. And so I think when I was younger, I would have learned a lot more, honestly, if I asked these questions earlier on. I wish I did. I didn't. So that was, bummer for me. So try to push through that, and don't make sure you're actually learning and asking the questions you need to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Kind of taking control of the situation, being confident and asking questions. All right, unless anyone has anything else, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to have time for our last question here. What is the best piece of professional advice you've ever received?
So I was asked this recently on another panel, but it's changed. So I didn't receive this advice, but it's advice that was given that I've taken. Cleve Jones is a really famous LGBTQ rights activist. He's responsible for the AIDS quilt, and he also fought Prop 8 in California. But one of his main mantras was one struggle, one fight. So essentially, we're all trying to increase and equality for political, economic, and social issues for all people, right? But we can't cannibalize our efforts, right? We're women, we're people of color, we're queer people, we're people with disabilities, but we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to make lives better for everybody. So we can't cannibalize we can't devolve into tribalism. We have to build each other up and rise together, you know? And so it's really working across the intersectionalities of all these identities together to demonstrate to the majoritarian society that we deserve all the things that they have. So it's really building communities and building cross-sectional communities. So for example, at Outer Energy, we've collaborated with Hispanics in Energy, with Asians in Energy, with Women Energy Network, because queer people are everybody, first of all, and that is just sensible. But it's also important because if you look at queer history, a lot of the civil rights movement for queer people took directly from the African-American civil rights history and civil rights movement. So we know there's so much to learn from one another, but also so much to gain by working together. So it's really about joining forces.
Love it. Anyone else? Best professional advice?
I'll jump in. That's okay. Firstly, I just want to massively agree with what Zach has just said. I think that intersectionality point is so important. I heard this saying once. I'm not sure where I heard it from, but none of us are equal until all of us are equal. And I just think it's such an important thing that we should support. The best piece of advice that I've received, and Zach has also mentioned this previously, is just to get a mentor. Like, find someone who has experience in your field. Find someone who you can trust, who for us as queer, rainbow professionals, someone who is also potentially queer or rainbow, because we often face pretty unusual or different experiences, whether that's discrimination in the workplace or or whatever, and they can impart that knowledge. So my best piece of advice that I've received and have utilized is get a mentor or find a mentor.
Love it. Nicole or Gia, any closing words? Best professional advice?
Nothing to add, I don't think.
All right.
Yeah, these are great. I think just the view of thinking of those mentors when you get that opportunity, or doing informational interviews, is thinking of people as and sort of tying that together, like not people that you need to impress, but kind of colleagues and sort of participants in whatever that mission is that you're trying to accomplish. It sort of helps to break down some of those barriers a little bit. Again, when I was sort of unemployed for a long time and doing a lot of informational interviews, once I started to think about these people as that we cared about the same topic, as sort of like, that was really why I wanted to talk to them, was because we cared about the same thing, and I was curious about what their experience or their view was on it, and really trying to kind of focus on that commonality of mission is a good one.
Yeah, I really love that, Gia. I think a big theme that I've seen in this discussion is that we're all just people. So, talk to your LGBT coworkers like you would your heterosexual coworkers. Like, we're all just people. Talk to mentors like they're just people. And we all care about climate change and energy and the environment, and rising tide lifts all boats. So with that, thank you, Zach, Gia, Edon, and Nicole, for joining us today and providing your insight and wisdom to the NEWIEE community. I would also like to again thank our sponsors who make our events possible, and especially First Light for sponsoring today's panel. With that, I will let you all go. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did, and check out our website for more events in the future. Thanks, everybody.